Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. This week, the eyes of the world are more focused on Ukraine than ever. President Zelensky's visit to the United States ahead of the UN summit, along with meetings with President Joe Biden and the presidential candidates, is making waves across the globe. The Ukrainian president's diplomatic push comes in response to a deteriorating situation on the front lines and the approaching winter, which could prove brutally harsh for the Ukrainian people. But as you might expect, Moscow isn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for the diplomatic efforts. Vladimir Putin is back at it again, playing the nuclear card and drawing new red lines for the West not to cross. More threats, more bluster, but what's really going on behind the headlines? Let's take a look at a report to find out more.
Can you talk to us now?
In his speeches before the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy stressed the urgency of preventing Russia from targeting Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. An attack like this would also threaten the security of other European countries.
Putin has broken so many international norms and rules that he won't stop on his own. Russia can only be forced into peace. And that is exactly what's needed.
More aid for Ukraine was announced during Zelensky's meeting with his U.S. counterpart.
Now we have to strengthen Ukraine's position on the battlefield. And that's why today I'm proud to announce a new $2.4 billion package of security assistance.
Earlier this week, the White House has announced another military aid package for Ukraine worth $375 million, including, for the first time, a medium-range glide bomb JSOW compatible with F-16 fighter jets. Moscow reacted with a move up the escalation ladder, announcing an overhaul of its nuclear response rules.
Aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear weapon state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear weapon state, should be regarded as a joint attack on the Russian Federation. We reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression against Russia and Belarus. This includes cases when the enemy, using conventional weapons, poses a critical threat to our sovereignty.
Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, but at the General Assembly there were voices of criticism and calls for a reform of the body.
The existing international security architecture, represented by the UN Security Council, continues to hamper efforts to maintain international peace and security.
The General Assembly High-Level Week concludes on Friday, September 27th.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. President Zelensky's whirlwind tour of Western capitals is more than just a photo op marathon. It's a desperate effort to rally the West around Ukraine's cause. With each passing day, the war drags on and fatigue among Kyiv's ally grows. Zelensky's visit to the United States and meeting with global leaders serve as a stark reminder that this war isn't just Ukraine's problem. It's a growing threat to Europe and beyond. And then, just as Zelenskyy is making his case for unity, Putin decides to escalate things by expanding the conditions under which Russia might use nuclear weapons. The timing? Not coincidental. By lowering the bar for when nuclear weapons might be used, Putin is trying to counteract Ukraine's diplomatic momentum with a not-so-subtle message: back off or else. Putin's gambit is clear. He wants to spook the West into backing away from Ukraine by waving the specter of nuclear conflict. It's classic Cold War brinksmanship designed to sow fear of global escalation. But both the United States and the European Union are calling his bluff, denouncing these threats as reckless and irresponsible. Ukraine, meanwhile, stands firm despite the mounting pressure. The West knows the stakes, and so does Putin. Zelenskyy didn't arrive in the U.S. empty-handed. He brought with him a so-called victory plan, but according to senior U.S. and EU officials familiar with the details, the plan doesn't exactly lay out a clear path to victory. That's because on the ground, things aren't looking great. Russian forces are slowly but surely making steady advances, and the front line remains a grinding stalemate. Most of Ukraine's allies continue to show strong political and military support, but there is a catch. The idea of using Western weapons to strike targets in Russian soil is dividing Kyiv's supporters. It's a dilemma that complicates everything. The longer the war drags on, the more these divisions are likely to grow. And then there's the elephant in the room. The upcoming US presidential elections, with uncertainty swirling over whether American support will hold if Donald Trump wins, Zelenskyy is facing the grim reality that his country's future could be hanging by a political thread. As the winter chill sets in, Ukraine's fight isn't just on the battlefield. It's in the halls of power across the West, and Zelenskyy is racing against time to ensure his country doesn't get left out in the cold. And now joining us to shed more light on the issue is Teuvo Teuvainen, professor of world politics at the University of Helsinki. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Wonderful to join Eastern Express.
So we're trying to explore Zelenskyy's trip to the United States in the broader context of the Russia-Ukraine war and the recent nuclear rhetoric that has been amping up. What do we know so far about the peace plan that Zelenskyy has brought to the United States? Do you think that's actually going to shift things going forward?
Well, one thing that it depends on is what will happen with the possibility that the United States and other Western countries will allow Ukraine use weapons for longer strikes within Russia, inside Russia. So that's certainly one thing. Yesterday's meetings didn't bring any clear clarity on that, so there was no real breakthrough on that front.
Right. It does seem that the U.S. administration has a little bit of hesitancy when it comes to approving the use of its weapons to strike inside Russia. Zelenskyy is trying to appeal to whoever he can to try to make it happen. But ultimately, who is the one that will be able to say, yes, Zelenskyy, go ahead and do it?
Yes, I think Joe Biden, since a long time, has been hesitant about allowing certain things where Vladimir Putin has been threatening directly or indirectly with that would escalate, and the fear of nuclear conflict is something that seems to be that Joe Biden seems to be thinking about. And I think it's clear now, especially as Putin again came up with hints that there might be a nuclear dimension to this conflict.
Right, like you mentioned, Putin is turning up the nuclear rhetoric, revising his nuclear doctrine to include not just the use of a weapon of mass destruction, but even just a NATO country's arm within Russia. Now, this is a very, very specific change, almost as if it is aimed towards this particular topic of using long-range weapons inside Russia. Is it so that it is actually threatening enough to Russia that Putin have to issue that threat?
Well, I think it's clear the threat has been specifically tailored for this moment, though it may have more general implications. And I think one thing that it may mean for the US administration is that they want to be more careful in case they allow, and I think it's likely they will somehow publicly or non-publicly allow for more strikes within Russia, even with US weapons or weapons like UK weapons that have some US parts, that they would be restricted to military targets inside Russia. So if and try to exclude the possibility that Russia could claim that the weapons are used against explicitly civilian targets. So I think that's one issue in this whole game of where is the red line and how is Putin threatening and how is Biden responding, where I think there are negotiations going on.
Right, but if we look into the incursion of the Kursk region, it does seem to me like a lot of the so-called red lines have been crossed, erased, drawn, redrawn again, and time and again, Ukraine did show that their actions within Russia didn't really trigger the type of response that Putin constantly threatens to. Isn't that a strong enough message for the Western world that perhaps these red lines were taking a little bit, well, these threats were taking a little bit too seriously when it comes to Putin's side, or do you think that the overly cautious approach is still warranted?
Well, about the Kursk situation, I think if we look at this as a political gamble or attempt by Ukraine to show that red lines are purely rhetorical and don't really exist, especially if they get the permission to use weapons inside Russia. It has been successful in that technical and military sense beyond whatever it means on the battleground itself. Then with the red lines, I mean, we can never be sure. Of course, since 1945, we've been living in this situation of nuclear threat and Cuban Missile Crisis and other things, and the risk is certainly very high, and I'm sure that's what Biden is thinking about. Even if one red line has been crossed, and then another one, and now the Kursk situation, it doesn't yet falsify the possibility that real red line somewhere in the patience of Putin, or whether you want to call his madness coming out or just his patience wearing out or whatever it is, that he might push the button. So there's no certainty on that. So that's why the risks are so high, and that's why Biden is proceeding cautiously.
Right, perhaps even though the red line that we can see is being drawn and redrawn again, an actual one actually exists somewhere, and there's a worry that that might be triggered. Now, coming back to the situation with the Ukrainian president's visit to the United States and trying to engage not just Biden, but also all the other candidates, do you think that there's any sort of contingency once Biden administration is replaced?
I think it's clear there's a significant choice between Harris and Trump. And as we know, Trump has been very explicit within all the ambiguities that he normally displays, that he will try to force both sides in a negotiation table and get to a truce and treaty and whatever it is. And obviously, from Ukrainian side, it seems that this might mean some kind of land for peace, or something I would call sovereignty for peace kind of deal, where both at least Crimea and perhaps some other parts would be ceded to Russia, and also negotiation that has to do with sovereignty, that Ukraine would not in NATO and perhaps other Western alliances. So this is clearly something that Trump is pushing for. Whereas with Harris, as she said yesterday, she will continue supporting Ukraine as the administration has done. Actually, I think especially if Democrats were to win Congress in a sort of major way, I think support for Ukraine might be even increased. And also, if Trump loses, then it means that the MAGA dimension in the Republican Party will lose some of its influence, and this might have major consequences also for how Republicans see the Ukrainian conflict, because they wouldn't have to be afraid of Trump anymore to the extent they have been now. So it is a major moment, and many are waiting for the US election to see what happens. Now it seems perhaps peace or truce negotiations are not moving forward before that. I'd be surprised if something significant happens before the US election.
These meetings come just ahead of the UN summit that will be taking place, and people are already discussing about what are some of the sideline discussions are going to be. What are your take on it, and do you think that that might push things forward a little bit for Ukraine?
Well, I think the bilateral conversations between Zelenskyy and the US presidential candidates and the current president might be more important for the future of Ukraine and the conflict than what happens more generally in the UN meetings. Of course, there's this dimension about who gets the who wins the hearts and minds of, for example, the global south. And Zelenskyy has possibilities to try to charm and convince countries from Africa or Latin America or Asia about the importance of supporting Ukraine in this conflict. But I think it's a secondary role for Zelenskyy in his stay in New York right now. Meeting Trump and before Biden and Harris much more important.
Do you think a humanitarian aspect would give him a stronger argument going into this? As we know, winter is coming very soon, and Russia is already targeting Ukraine's infrastructure. If no more support go in, Ukraine might be facing a very harsh and cold winter. And that might change the calculations for people who are hesitant about supporting Ukraine, no?
That's true. Then again, some Africans might say that there are many humanitarian situations ranging from Sudan to Gaza and to many places. So I'm not sure the humanitarian argument in the context of Ukraine now is something that in itself will help change the hearts and minds of the global south that might be hesitant about supporting Ukraine. It may play some role, but I wouldn't exaggerate it.
Right, and last but not least, of course, Zelenskyy didn't go empty-handed to the U.S. We're talking once again about this victory plan, but according to U.S. and EU officials, this plan doesn't really have exactly laid out a clear path to victory. Do you think the vagueness was intentional, or is there anything that Zelenskyy can provide, like a concrete enough plan to convince his partners that maybe Ukrainian cause is worth supporting to the end?
Yeah, well, the whole concept of victory here is a bit unclear. What does it mean? I think many analysts see that Ukraine is now fighting for better conditions in the negotiation table. Actually, from being from Finland, it resembles, in some aspects, situation in 1944 when Russia, Soviet Union, had started an all-out attack on Finland. Seemed, they are coming and they're going to invade unless we get some support from somewhere. And the idea of getting support from somewhere was not that Finland would somehow beat Russia or Soviet Union, but it was more like that we will be able to show that it's not easy to win us and get some smaller victories and thereby get a better position in the negotiation table. Of course, the end result of Finland in 1945 was not what Zelenskyy would expect to get in a negotiation table now, because in Finland we had to cede land to the Soviet Union and there were other concessions. But the constellation might be something like that victory can mean so many things, and I don't think anybody believes that victory will mean, it could mean that Russia will disintegrate and all that, like victory in the traditional sense. But I guess the idea of at least securing that no other parts of Ukraine than Crimea will be ceded, and ideally for Ukraine, not even Crimea will be ceded de facto or de jure, that would probably consider some kind of victory. But right. It's unclear. It's more a slogan like this victory plan, and I think Western leaders are a little bit perplexed of what it's supposed to mean.
Right, perplexing indeed, and we do have to wait and see what happens. In the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on the Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Now, kicking off this Eastern News Flash, let's focus on the Polish-Belarusian border, where migratory pressure is intensifying.
Poland's defense minister, Władysław Kośniak-Kamysz, has described the increasing migratory pressure at the country's border with Belarus as serious but manageable. During a briefing of security services and army commanders in the northwestern Polish village of Karakule, the official said on Thursday that despite the deployment of 17,000 troops in early August to strengthen border security, the pressure had been increasing in recent days and weeks. The minister revealed that there had already been over 2,500 attempted illegal crossings in September alone, with a total of 26,000 recorded since the start of the year, surpassing the total number for all of 2023. Border authorities report an average of 120 daily attempts to cross illegally from Belarus, with frequent attacks on Polish officers. In June, a Polish soldier was fatally stabbed by a migrant at the border.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is reportedly considering holding presidential elections in Ukraine, despite previous plans to postpone the vote until the war ends.
Although the Ukrainians' trust in Zelenskyy has slumped from 80% in May 2023 to 45% this year, according to the US-based National Democratic Institute, the president is said to be weighing calling a presidential election next year to consolidate his power. According to Ukraine's former PM, Yulia Tymoshenko, with the political process already underway, there is much debate about Zelenskyy's potential rivals. One of them is former army chief Valery Zaluzhny, who was removed from his position in February. Polls have shown Ukrainians like the idea of being led by a former soldier.
Azerbaijan is set to bolster its air defense capabilities with new fighter jets. The aircraft, which are Chinese-made, will be purchased from Pakistan. Let's dive deeper into the story.
Pakistan's military announced on Thursday that it had signed a deal to sell JF-17 Block 3 fighter jets to Azerbaijan. These crafts are co-produced by the Pakistan Aeronautical Complex in partnership with China, a country with which Pakistan has strengthened ties, as its traditional military relationship with the United States has weakened in recent years. While details on the cost or the number of jets were not disclosed, the military statement emphasized that the sale aligns with Islamabad's efforts to enhance defense cooperation with friendly nations and to boost Azerbaijan's air power capabilities. Pakistan also maintains close relations with Turkey, which supported Azerbaijan during its conflict with Armenia last year, a resurgence of long-standing hostilities between the two South Caucasus nations.
A wave of arrests is sweeping through Belarus, targeting the country's LGBTQ+ community. Here's more on this developing story.
At least 8 transgender individuals have been arrested, with around a dozen others detained in Belarus since August, according to the transgender support group TG House Belarus. Its representative, speaking anonymously, reported that the crackdown on the LGBT community began in late August, intensifying in early September. Most of the detained transgender individuals were charged with hooliganism. In addition, 2 people were facing criminal charges related to the distribution of pornography. The arrests took place in several cities across Belarus, with detainees reportedly subjected to beatings, psychological intimidation, and verbal abuse. The clampdown prompted several individuals fearing further persecution to flee the country. The groundwork for this crackdown was laid in April, when the Ministry of Culture passed a resolution classifying any LGBT-related expression as pornography, echoing a similar development in Russia.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.